What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another Buzz Beat, and thanks for joining us for another episode. This is Richie, and I am back on the microphone with Darian and Brian taking a much needed break. We are recording this in the middle of the NBA Finals. We are about 2 weeks out from the NBA draft, and Dylan Jackson will be joining me for today's episode, and he's also to my knowledge, is still going to be joining us live on draft night. And we always appreciate your Hornets takes, your draft analysis. Dylan, how are you?
I'm doing good. It feels kind of surreal that it's only 2 weeks away now, the draft, and I feel like the playoffs have gone by pretty quickly compared to most years.
Yeah, it does feel that way. And I think I can't imagine this series going longer than 5 or 6, but who knows? Maybe the Mavericks turn it around. We're actually recording this, before Game 3. So by the time you're listening to this, it may already be 3-0 Boston. We'll see how that goes. But today's episode, we are going to talk about some bigger picture questions surrounding the NBA draft, surrounding the offseason, and we will get to those first. And then at the end, I'm sure we'll have time for this, but I want to get your thoughts on some of the prospects in the Hornets range. So let's get to the first question here from Daniel in our Substack. How do you expect the previous experiences of Charles Lee and Jeff Peterson to affect what qualities and archetypes of players rank higher on the Hornets' internal draft board, if at all? So I think this question can be applied to the draft. I think this question can be applied to free agency as well, just like the types of players that they're trying to pick up. And I think sometimes with the NBA draft, you can't be, so broad with what you're looking for. You kind of have to draft the guy that's available and that's worth it at the 6th overall pick and not reach on guys just because they fit a specific mold. However, if there is a draft, to my knowledge, that you could lean more on specific qualities, maybe fitting a particular vision for Charles Lee, I feel like this would be the draft to do it in. And I think if Jeff Peterson and Charles Lee were to lean on some of their previous experiences and rank guys higher on their board because of that, I think there are a few things that they would value. Now, whether or not that turns out to be true come 2 weeks from now when they actually draft the guy, does it fit this mold? Maybe, maybe not. But I think one thing for sure that I think about when I think of Charles Lee and his teams that he's had over the years, and not when I say his teams, he's obviously an assistant coach, but like you take a look at the Celtics this year, you take a look at the seasons that he had with the Bucks. Like these teams were consistently in the top 10 for two-way play, like both offense and defense. And it's very hard to find guys like Drew Holiday or Jaylen Brown, but you've got to fill the roster with guys that are not so one-dimensional. Guys like Bobby Portis or Devin Carter over the years with the Bucks, who, have their limitations, but they definitely fill a role on both ends of the court. And then the Atlanta team, too, like going all the way back to Charles Lee's first assistant job under Budenholzer, like that was a very balanced team. They had 60 wins in that first season that he was there. And in the 3, 4, 5 years of however long he was there, like the defense was just very, very solid. And I think with the Hornets, like you don't have a lot of guys that are like two-way players. So that's the first thing that like sticks out to me, Dylan. So first off, what do you think about that? Like two-way players, maybe where you see that with the Hornets roster currently. And then is there any other types of things that you think about when you associate Charles Lee and his previous coaching experiences?
Yeah, I'll start with Lee himself because if you look at this Celtics team currently in the finals and you look at the Bucks teams of the past like 4 or 5 years, there are some trends there, and there's even like a common player like Drew Holiday who fits very well on both teams, two-way guard, elite defender. But there's also guys like Derek White, Malcolm Brogdon, Eric Bledsoe, all these guys who at the very least aren't bad defensively. You know what I mean? Like there's some guys, like George Hill, Jeff Teague, there's players that aren't the best defenders that have been on teams under Charles Lee, but looking at the impact guys that you're paying high figures, it's all like guys that can defend and do it at a high level. So looking at like those guards in particular, defense is definitely something that, Lee probably prioritizes. It's going to be hard to determine whether, Peterson is going to prioritize a certain archetype because looking back at his tenure in particular, like with the Nets, he was, the director of scouting, or sorry, he was an assistant GM with the Nets. He was director of scouting for the Hawks for a few years. But even with like the most influential draft with the Hawks, for instance, which was 2018, that Trae Young draft, that was also Travis Schlenk's like first full draft cycle, going through it with the Hawks. So it was almost like he was playing backseat to a guy like that, trying to make his imprint on the team. In terms of draft philosophy, there's a few like trends that you can look at from, his time scouting. Athleticism is something that he seems to prioritize. If you look at a few of the players like, for instance, John Collins or Taurean Prince, DeAndre Bembry when he was with Atlanta. If you look at guys like Cam Thomas, who's not a bad athlete, Noah Clowney. Dariq Whitehead's a little bit more interesting because he had some injury issues at Duke that season, but there's a few trends there. It's just hard because a lot of these players that the Nets and Hawks have drafted over the past few years don't really have a sort of correlation, so it's going to be interesting to see. And this is going to be a more so telling draft than maybe others because the value is so even among so many different players at the top of this draft. Like, I don't know how your draft board looks, but I have Sarr at 1 in
I don't
kind of a
have
tier of his own. Yeah. I've got Sarr in a tier of his own at the top. I would say, like, in an average draft class, you would be maybe like the 4th, maybe 3rd pick overall, right?
Right.
After that, I have a tier of 8 different players who could feasibly go, 2nd overall, right? Like Reed Shepherd, Ron Holland, like Steph Castle, Devin like there's so many guys in that 2nd tier for me. So it's not like a bad year to have the 6th pick per se, but I think we're going to get a lot of the team building philosophy from both Charles Lee and Jeff Peterson. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. Kind of going back to Charles Lee just a little bit, I think another trend that you kind of see from him in particular, or the teams that he's been on at least, and this might just be more of a Giannis thing more than anything, but if you look at all of the big men who got consistent minutes for teams that Charles Lee has coached, they all can shoot at least to some capacity. Like Brook Lopez became a very good shooter over his time in, I think late Brooklyn is kind of when he started to shoot, but especially when he got to Milwaukee. Kristaps Porzingis, everybody knows about him. Al Horford has become an excellent shooter. Even guys like Christian Wood, Xavier Tillman, John Henson to a degree as well. Like there's plenty of big men over, these teams that Lee has coached that have become good shooters, or at least passable shooters. Good considering that they're 7 feet tall.
Yeah, I think that was the second thing that I was going to go to was the shooting. And, the Al Horford development came after Lee. Like, in Atlanta, he wasn't necessarily anything other than like a mid-range shooter, but that three-point shot did come later. You got the Brook Lopez, like you mentioned, the Porzingis, who's hobbling right now in the NBA Finals, but he's having a good NBA Finals. Sam Hauser, Derek White. Yeah, you get the point. I mean, the threat is there. And, I think with the Hornets, like, we have these players that on occasion, like LaMelo Ball and Miles Bridges prior to this past season, that can drive and they want to kick it out to guys that are open on the outside. But, there's a lot of times you're passing it out to Cody Martin and Cody Martin's not going to shoot that three, or if he does, it's just not going to go in at a consistent rate. And you see Boston in these finals where they are just constantly putting pressure in the paint for drive and kicks. They are putting opponents in like scramble mode because they have threats on the outside. It just doesn't have the same effect when you've got players like Cody Martin. No disrespect to him as a player, but as a shooter, it's just not there. And you mentioned this too with Brook Lopez. Like Charles Lee has been on some teams with bigs that can shoot the ball, that can extend the court, that can bring opposing bigs out of the paint. And I think with Mark Williams and Nick Richards right now, they are very, very similar type of players where they have a role in which they are bigs that set screens and roll hard to the rim and maybe play out of the dunker spot. But they're not going to be guys that can extend the defense out to the 3-point line. So I think there's something to be said about that in terms of finding a guy that is a big that can draw opponents out there. And I don't know if there's a guy like that in the NBA draft that would even be in the Hornets range, or if they traded back, or if they traded up from the second round, and maybe they would have to look via trade or via free agency. But I think that's something that they should probably look to as well, just kind of that change up from the center position. So shooting is something that I thought of too, Dylan, and the two-way play. And I guess another thing too is with the Hornets, because of the injuries and the lack of depth, I think the roles that the players have had to play have been very fluid. But I also think that, a player needs to be comfortable with playing 12 minutes a night or 22 minutes a night, and having guys that don't feel like it's too big for the moment. And it's going to come down to talent when it's all said and done. But I don't feel like the Hornets have enough versatility with some of their players, but also like versatility within a role. Like Grant Williams, for example, like he was able to step right in for Charlotte last season, and he was okay with starting. He was okay with coming off the bench. He was okay taking a back seat. He was okay to step up when he was called upon. I just don't feel like there's a balance there with some of these players where it just feels like, man, if you play Bryce McGowan's 18 minutes, like you just don't know what you're going to get out of that guy. And I think the balance that you find with some of these teams that Charles Lee has been on, it's not just about a balance of on offense and defense, but about finding the balance within the role that they have and knowing when to deviate, knowing when to step up if you can. Like Bobby Portis, for example, is the one guy that kind of stands out to me in Milwaukee when I think of this idea that he's a player, like you can go get a bucket if you need it. But there's so many other players on that team that they need to feed within the lineup. But if he needed to, he could go fill out the stat sheet. And, I get that the injuries played a big role with the Hornets this past season. And I'm not discounting that by any means, but I think players have got to learn to be able to shift in and out of lineups, shift in and out of roles. And I think defined roles are important, but also being a guy that could be molded into a couple different roles and not feel out of your element when your number is called. I think that's a big thing. So, I think in reality, it's all going to come down to talent, and that fixes a lot of different things with the way that they kind of go out there. Is there a big in this draft that can stretch the court?
Not that I would take at 6 that's
Right,
not named Alex Sarr. And he's definitely going to be gone by
right.
that point. Looking at my board, some people believe Klingon is going to be able to shoot it. I
Mm,
am not one of those people. There's bigger players who probably aren't centers, like Saloon from France. After that, there's like Kyle Filipowski, who I wouldn't take at 6, probably not even in the lottery, to be honest with you. So there's guys who could potentially do it in this draft. It's just the value wouldn't be there for the Hornets to go out of their way to trade for a selection to get one of those guys.
gotcha. So outside of defense, two-way play, shooting, the balancing of the roles, is there anything that stands out to you from his tenure, Charles Lee's tenure, that probably is going to be a part of his roster building moving forward?
There's really nothing kind of in particular. A lot of it comes down to like this team already has the core pieces in place, so it's a lot of fitting kind of what you can around those guys. LaMelo Ball, Brandon Miller, and I believe both the coach and general manager have said Mark Williams as well. So it's more of putting pieces around the cards that you've been dealt. If you look at kind of the conference finals teams this year, the Mavs, the Timberwolves, the Celtics, and the Pacers, they all have like drastically different team building strategies. And of course, like they're going to be good at shooting, they're going to be good at defense, they're going to have length. But the two in particular that I think the Hornets are likely going to attempt to follow are going to be the Pacers and the Mavericks, because both of those teams have that heliocentric type piece offensively. Halliburton, Luca, and the Hornets have a diet version of that, kind of until proven otherwise with LaMelo Ball. So ideally, what you want to do is put shooters and length defensively around a player like LaMelo. Guys where LaMelo's going to drive to the rim, can kick it out, they can hit shots, something like that. There's not really anything that stands out to me outside of what we already covered with Charles Lee or Peterson. And Peterson, like I said, is going to be a tougher case to crack because we don't really know how much influence he had in the Nets draft room, in the Hawks draft room, that sort of thing. So it's going to be hard and a lot more telling after this first draft in particular to see, okay, what are the types of players that this organization is going to be targeting in the future, right? Like two very, very different players who could potentially be available, like Reed Shepherd, like a 50+% 3-point shooter, high effort defensively, but the size isn't there. And are they going to knock him for that? Versus Steph Castle, who's almost the inverse of that, where you've got length, you've got defense, you've got, kind of like a glue guy offensively and defensively with Steph Castle. So it's really going to be telling in terms of what kind of player that they're going to be, aiming to get here. And it's interesting because it's more of a role player draft. You're not
Mhm.
necessarily swinging for the fences. And because the value is so flat across the board, that's why it's going to be, maybe more telling than other years.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Castle and Reed Shepherd. I think most people might say, as of now, like Reed Shepherd might be the better prospect. But the one thing that he's got working against him is his size, which he can't change. And the one thing working against Castle is his shot, which you could change, right? So, like, is there anything about that maybe you or whoever might lean towards Castle over Reed Shepherd because of that one aspect right there?
So I'm a huge believer in Reed Shepherd, kind of
Okay.
what he does. I like both players. I have them both top 10. I have Reed Shepherd second. So that's kind of like the big difference because end of day, the one skill between either player that's like truly top tier elite is Reed Shepherd's shooting.
Mm.
It is incredibly rare that you find a guy who on volume is shooting above 50% on a college level. And these like aren't easy shots either. He's, a good secondary facilitator. I think his defense is better than given credit for. He's extremely high effort on that end, generates a lot of turnovers, but like you said, you can't change the size. That's a part of it that, you know, it comes with the player. You can do things to minimize it, but I mean, if you look at the draft or if you look at, the finals right now, how many small guards are playing? Like Peyton Pritchard, Kyrie Irving. Like Kyrie Irving's the big one, but he's also like a top 1% scorer. So do you expect that of Reed Shepherd or, Castle's probably the higher floor guy just because of the physical traits that he gets you. It's just, is the shot going to come around? Because if he can't fix the shot, how playable is he going to be in the playoffs?
Yeah. I mean, we talk about two-way play. We talk about, I think the one thing that we did not mention was just like positional size. I think Hornets need more of that. But if they need shooting and Reed Shepherd is there, I think it'd be hard to pass on him if he does drop to number 6. So let's get to the second question here. And it kind of dovetails off the first question. But are there any current playoff observations that translate to current draft evaluation? And that is from Matt Wood in our Substack. And I think one thing that, and I'm gonna probably keep referring back to the Celtics, not just because they're in the NBA Finals, but because they're up in the NBA Finals, but also because Charles Lee is a part of the staff, but just kind of playing as a collective unit. I know that's kind of a very broad term, but when I watch the Celtics, yes, like it's Jason Tatum. Like you think of the Celtics when you think of Jason Tatum, when you think of the Celtics, unless your name is Jason Kidd, but like he is having shooting wise an inefficient first two games. Game 3 is happening later tonight following this recording, but he's still making an imprint on this game with his rebounding and his passing. And he isn't just settling for shots and hoping to get back in the groove. He's driving, he's collapsing the defense, he's kicking it out to shooters. And he had this one pass, I think it was in game 1, where he's driving across the paint to the right block and the Mavs might have been in his zone at this point. 2 or 3 guys are around him. He kicks it out to the opposite corner to Derek White for a 3-point shot. It's just the awareness of knowing where all the teammates are and being on the same page as a collective unit. I think that's one thing that stands out to me. Now, I don't know how that translates to like draft evaluation because it's very hard to know which players are going to mesh with which players, but Tatum, for example, is the guy that you think about. And obviously he's an extreme talent. But I think when you think about the Boston Celtics, there's a lot of different guys that are pitching in right now. And probably one of the biggest reasons as to why they're up 2-0, because, Tatum's not having his greatest of series shooting the ball, but he is going to make the right play when he's doubled. Look for cutters. He's going to draw on defenders. So I'm not saying that the Hornets are getting the next Tatum in the draft, because I don't think that player exists. But to my previous point about kind of knowing your role, knowing when to step up, knowing when to take a step back, depending on what the defense is giving you. And last thing that I'll mention about like the observation is that like with any team that has playoff success, which first off, the Hornets haven't even made the playoffs, like you need veterans, you need guys that have been there before. So this doesn't necessarily apply to drafting, but maybe more so the free agency. And I think that's one of the deciding factors here with the Celtics and Mavericks. Like it's probably not the biggest effect, biggest factor, but it's got to be up there in terms of just players that have played significant minutes. And the only guy on the Hornets right now is Grant Williams. Like, is there another guy on the Hornets that has playoff experience like that?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Just
I don't think so.
looking at their roster right now, I don't think any of these guys, unless like Davis Bertans
Yeah.
played a season that I'm forgetting about.
Yeah.
But I mean, the experience is something that's incredibly crucial to this team. Like you said earlier, with the young players, not necessarily, being versatile in the role that they're being asked to play. I think a lot of that stems from they aren't comfortable in any particular role yet. Like they're not even playing well in what they should be doing. Like Nick Smith, for example, being a guy that you want to, bring off the bench, be like a microwave scorer type. He had some moments last year that were nice, but I mean, there's only so much you can ask from like a, 27th overall pick, right? Like there's just a lot of guys on that team, and we saw it after the trade deadline when it was Seth Curry, it was Vasham Nisic playing, it was Davis Bertans playing, Grant Williams playing. We saw it after the trade deadline that once you have these veterans in place, even though it was only for a span of like 3 games, right, that things really kind of exploded for a minute. When you have these veterans in place and they know what to do, it actually looks like your bench unit is capable of, maybe going on a run, where that hasn't been the case the past, 18 months with this team prior to that trade deadline. So I think, getting that veteran experience is going to be incredibly crucial to this team. You kind of see it all the time with how teams speed up their timeline almost. Like the Timberwolves, for example, adding guys like Kyle Anderson, Rudy Gobert, Mike Conley, for instance, like teams like that. And I think another aspect that I kind of want to point out is all 4 players, 1 through 4 on the Celtics, can dribble, pass, and shoot, and that's the case for, a lot of different teams that are advancing far into the playoffs. Like if you look at the Thunder, that's kind of their main draft philosophy. Guys like Jalen Williams, even though he's playing the 4, can dribble, pass, shoot. Chet Holmgren, to an extent, can do that. Both of their guards can do that between Giddey, between Shea, and many, many guys on their bench. They kind of need to do a consolidation move, but that's kind of besides the point. There's those 3 aspects I think are very important when you're trying to get guys who are comfortable both on and off the ball, who are comfortable playing team basketball. If you can add a guy like KCP to this current roster who's experienced with, playoff basketball, has played with a heliocentric player before with Nikola Jokic, and plays both offense and defense at a high level, I think that's kind of what you're aiming for.
Yeah. I mean, he's going to be sought after, and I think it might take a little bit of an overpayment to kind of get him here to Charlotte. But he's one of the guys that I highlighted in a piece that I have releasing on Monday about some free agents that have that experience. Because I think there are several check boxes that the Hornets kind of need to cover, and we talked about it: the shooting, the defensive size, but I think the winning background plays a big role, and knowing his role within the team. I think the likelihood that he comes to Charlotte might be like 15-20%, but like there is a path in which they can offer him something competitive. Sure, it might be an overpay, but he's a guy that I think would fit right in with this roster. And I think one other thing too, you mentioned this, is like just speed up the timeline. Do you feel like that's what the Hornets need to do this offseason, or do you feel like baby steps? Like, is there an opportunity for them to go after a KCP, or is that, should we wait on that next offseason, or does it really matter to you? I guess is kind of what I'm getting at.
I think you have to pick your right time to decide when you want to accelerate things, because you have to wait for the right trade to come along. Because ideally, you don't want to accelerate the timeline without getting a star level player, right? That's why you traded for the Miami pick. That's why you traded for the Dallas pick, is so that you have assets to eventually make that move. Especially, it's harder because of the Kai Jones trade so long ago, how that handicapped your ability to trade first round picks up until like 2026, if I'm not mistaken. So they're going to have to pick and choose. And kind of what I assume is going to happen this offseason is they're going to take in like maybe a larger contract, take in more assets with that contract, maybe wait for a few things to expire before they decide to, go in. Because as it stands right now, it's hard to decide to accelerate that timeline if your depth pieces are like Trey Mann, Grant Williams, and Nick Richards. Like, no offense to those guys, but I'm not incredibly confident that these are like high level rotation guys on an actual competitive playoff team.
You don't think Grant Williams is?
I think looking at like how he was in Boston last time that they were in the playoffs last year, I think that there were some moments that he wasn't quite up to par, and I think a lot of it has to do with just he's shorter for power forward, and there's just not much he can do about that. But I mean, given the value that they got him at, I think it's worth trying it. Like if he's your seventh player, that's fine. It's not ideal, but you could like, especially if it's your first year in the playoffs, that's fine. But if you want to be like go out and win a series, if your stars, assuming LaMelo Ball is what he is, we don't really know what he is because he's played 50 games the last 2 years, and assuming Brandon Miller is what you think he could be, I think Grant Williams could potentially, contribute to a playoff series win. But if you want to go far in the playoffs, I'm not sure that he's necessarily somebody that you want on the floor for, 30, 25 minutes a game.
Gotcha. All right. Well, it seems like I'm a little bit higher on him than you are of him. But I guess the last observation I have about this Boston team is just the fact it's probably more of a coaching thing. So I guess that's not necessarily a guy that you can target, but like they just seem to be on a string defensively. They make the correct rotations, they're anticipating passes. And I don't feel like Dallas is maybe making the defense move as much because they're ISO heavy, but the containment that Boston has on that end is very noteworthy. So it all goes back to talent. It all goes back to defense. And I think the Hornets need to beef up that aspect of their roster and finding the right types of players that Dylan and I have been talking about, and the intangibles that, are needed for a focus for this front office moving forward. Any other thoughts, Dylan, on, Jeff Peterson, the playoffs, before I ask you some questions about some draft prospects?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at Boston's roster, right? Like point guard to center, like, Derek White, Drew Holiday, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, all four of those guys are just phenomenal defenders,
Yeah.
right? That's just how it is. And they're so good, really on both ends, all four of those guys. And then you add in another like dynamic player with Kristaps, and it's just a recipe to be really, really good. I think that team is probably the most talented since kind of the whole like NBA duos rather than trios thing has started happening over like probably the past 5-ish years, but it's just like the defense of that team in particular. Like it is incredibly rare that you have that many high level defenders on the same team.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And let's go ahead and get into some draft talk, and we'll probably keep this to 7 minutes or less here. Just want to get your thoughts. And, I don't do a lot of draft research, or at least I haven't done enough so far. So getting your insight is good here. So let me just run down a couple of superlatives. I give you a category. You give me the player that fits the bill, and try to keep it within maybe the lottery, late lottery, just kind of in that range. And I think I know your answer to this one, but the best shooter in this draft is.
Yeah, it's Shepard. There's really no competition here. I mean, if you shoot 50+% from three on volume, it's gonna be you. And it's like we really haven't seen that figure in particular before. So it will come down in the NBA. Like he'll probably be like a 39 to 42% 3-point shooter in the NBA. But assuming that's what you get and you're getting that, you can't really bet against him not being the best shooter in this class.
Is he better on ball or off ball, or does he have a little bit of both?
I think he's a combo guard. I think he has skills that, you could play, point guard, shooting guard. I think his playmaking will look better in the NBA than it was at Kentucky because when you look at kind of Kentucky guards in the past, like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, um, there's a lot of other ones that are slipping my mind at the current moment, but a lot of them get, they don't really show all of the playmaking chops that they have just because there's so many guards every year at Kentucky. Like this year, both Reed Shepherd and Rob Dillingham were coming off of the bench. So to have the production that he did, I think it was like 3 or 4 assists per game at Kentucky was pretty good. Um, Obviously, I think the turnovers are going to have to go down, and his decision making is going to have to get better, especially initiating the offense. But with that said, I think there's definitely some on ball stuff there.
Good. All right. So another superlative: the best two-way player in the lottery is.
This one is a little bit more tough. I would say Devin Carter.
Okay.
If you want a guard, I think he's going to be a phenomenal defender. He showed a lot more, offensively than he has in the past. I think he averaged nearly 20 points a game. I have some concerns about his shot because it's not really something that looks the same a whole ton, but he did shoot like 40% from three this year. He showed a lot, in terms of playmaking. He's definitely going to be a more off the ball type guard at the next level. But if you want somebody who's, nearly guaranteed to be like at minimum a rotation player, I think he's the type of player that you want. He's intense. He's somebody that I really like for the Hornets in particular because he has that sort of mentality that you want that you don't necessarily have on this team right now, like that Brandon Miller like dog mentality in a way. So he's somebody that I kind of like for the Hornets, but he's definitely a two-way guy. Impactful, point of attack defender, makes a lot of plays on that end, steals. He's a really good defender in terms of getting blocks on the perimeter as well, which I just love to see from guards, just that energy and effort. And one thing I think kind of correlates to just effort level in general is rebounding numbers. And he was probably the best rebounding guard in college basketball last year.
Yeah, that's interesting because what was his height here? Six,
Six
six
like
four.
2, 6'3".
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
something like that.
Okay. All right. The player in the lottery, in your opinion, that has the biggest bust potential.
This one, I would say it's probably going to be unpopular because of his age, but I think Dalton Connect has a lot of bust potential. There was a podcast by Sam Vecini a while back, maybe like a whole year ago, where they were analyzing sort of the most risk averse and easiest kind of archetypes to translate into the NBA. And one of the points that was made on there is while, yes, like catch and shoot guys might have an easier role to translate, I think if you look at the success rate of those players translating to the NBA, if you're a pure catch and shooter, which I think that Connect is going to end up being that type of player because I don't trust his handle. The defense isn't quite there. I think that he's going to end up being like a catch and shoot guy, and he could be really good. But if you're 40% as a catch and shoot guy from three versus 37%, like that is a big difference for that archetype in particular. So if that's kind of the main contribution that you're giving your team, I think that the bust rate is higher on those players than people may think.
Yeah. Do you, I mean, this is kind of unrelated, but what do you buy into more? His defense improving or Stefan Castle's shot improving?
Steph Castle's shot. I
Okay.
think Steph Castle is what, like 3-4 years younger,
Yeah.
and B, I think the physical traits that Castle has are probably going to be as impactful as Connect shooting. I think, if you're getting a 42% three-point shooter consistently with a guy like Connect, then sure you could take him. But it's a lot of pressure when you're drafted, in the lottery to do one job, right? And a few shots could make the difference between you being playable and you being a low level rotation guy who's not going to get minutes in the playoffs. Like if you look at say the variance in Duncan Robinson's career, right? Like there's some years where he looks just really really good, like dominant as a catch and shoot guy, and he's also a guy who moves a ton off ball, and Connect does as well, not to that extent. But there's also years with Duncan Robinson where he's like, okay, he's a $15 million a year paperweight. You know what I mean? So there's just a lot of variance with catch and shoot, prospects in particular, that I think it's harder to translate that skill set than maybe what people would maybe think.
Okay. Two more questions. So first off, Jacoby Walter, I just saw this tweet today, was one of the 12 players or one of 12 players that were invited to the green room for the NBA draft. And I haven't heard his name a lot. I saw a couple clips here and there of him early on in the process when I've been kind of like researching and kind of went away from him because I just haven't heard his name a lot. But he's also working out for Charlotte this week, supposedly. So any thoughts on him? Not necessarily at 6. I mean, unless you thought he was available and would be okay to be picked at 6. But what are your thoughts about him as a player?
I'm not in on him at 6. I think he's
Right.
definitely more like late lottery, maybe even late teens type of guy for me. He's athletic, he can shoot, and his wingspan is really, really good. With that said, I think he's mostly a player that's going to be a shooter, on the perimeter, like a 2-3. I don't really think he moves the ball well offensively. Like we talked about, like dribble, pass, shoot. He's not really a passer. And while he does have that athleticism, he's not really physical, and he doesn't really bring like the finishing or efficiency that you'd like from a wing of his size or caliber. So I think there's traits there, like the athleticism for him, to maybe get better, but it's like with athletes in particular, the hard part for me is when you're trying to sell them everybody at the NBA level is going to be more athletic, like, and really truthfully, the shooting, I believe it was 34% from three. Like the form looks good. I have confidence that he'll be able to be at least like an average shooter, like 37-38% from three. I have confidence that that could happen. But, the defense isn't good. The finishing isn't where you would want it to be. And I don't think it's a case where, like with Brandon Miller, people, kind of knocked his finishing, but it was more so his athleticism trying to get to the rim when he was more of like a skillful type of player getting to the rim, more like, drawn out, but he had a lot of skill, manipulating defenses and defenders off of pick and roll actions and such. I don't really see that with Jacoby. I think he's more of like that athleticism type where it's less nuanced. It's more just try and beat the guy to the hoop. And there's draws with him. Like it is fun to watch him. And I think, if he does shoot it well, like he could be a rotation guy. It's just he's not the bet that I would take in the lottery this year.
Gotcha. All right, last question, and it's kind of a prediction-based question, but who are the three guys that you think are going to be there at six, or not at six, maybe like 5, 6, kind of in that range that it's going to come down to for Charlotte? And then of those three that maybe the Hornets are debating, like who would you choose? Again, it's kind of prediction-based here, but what do you think it's going to come down to here?
So looking at kind of like the draft order, I think Alex Sarr, Reed Shepard, Zachary Risache are all going to be gone. Those three. The fourth pick, San Antonio, I think is going to be Castle, and then I think Detroit's going to decide between Connect and Buzelis, which would leave Charlotte between Buzelis, Ron Holland potentially. I don't think they'll take Ron Holland. Maybe Steph Castle, Devin Carter, Klingon, Cody or Connect. Sorry, that's kind of a long list.
Yeah, no,
But
that's good.
uh, I think that one of the top players on the Hornets board is going to be Buzelis for a few reasons. The athleticism he brings from really either forward spot is kind of great. Like he is a phenomenal lob threat. I think his post game is pretty good. The shooting, they say in high school he was a really good shooter, and it didn't quite manifest itself, in the G League this year. I don't really know how truthful that is, but the numbers were really rough this year. But he was willing to shoot, which is cool. His frame is good. I like him a lot, especially if the Hornets plan on letting Miles Bridges walk in particular. I think that would make a ton of sense to bring him in if that's the case, because looking at the free agency market, there's like no power forwards unless you're going to sign Obi Toppin to a restricted free agency bag, or maybe even like Tobias Harris, something like that. And I'm not huge on either of those options. Uh, Connect, we kind of already talked about him a little bit. He would scare me a little bit, kind of what I talked about, because you would need him to be like a top, 5 percentile shooter in the NBA for him to be kind of a rotation level player, because I don't really think there's much else with his skill set there. Um, Cody Williams is interesting. I don't think he'll be the pick at 6 because I think his stock is a little bit lower, but he's kind of like a raw wing type who he's the brother of Jalen Williams. And to me, that's interesting because looking at how Jalen Williams filled out his frame first at Santa Clara and then in OKC these last 2 years, like if you think that's going to be the case with Cody, then he's a lot more appealing. But right now, he's just really, really raw and struggled a lot sometimes when he was at Colorado this year. I think those are kind of the options because I don't think they'll take Topic. I don't think they'll take Klingon. Saloon is a possibility, but I would be pretty surprised if they took him as well. I think Castle is going to go top 5. I just don't know to which team. But it's really hard because the draft is so flat. Like last year, the top 5 picks you could guess before the draft started.
Mhm.
Really, the top 6 almost. And the first pick that we didn't really know was Bilal Coulibaly at 7, and it's just this year is it's like the 2013 draft where nobody knew what the first pick was until it happened, and people thought it was going to be Nerlens Noel. It wasn't. He fell to 6, and I think it's similar to that. Like even the first few picks, people are saying it's Sarr, Risache. Who really knows?
Yeah, it's Jacoby Walter. So I'm in agreement with you. I feel like if I don't know why I keep going back to Buzelis, but if he is there at 6, I just get this sense that the Hornets are gonna take him because it does check off a lot of boxes in terms of what they're looking for. But we're gonna go
Yeah.
ahead and wrap here. We wanted to thank everyone for listening to us ad free and early through BuzzBeat Plus. We appreciate all our subscribers and our active participants over in the Substack chat. That's where we got these questions from to start the episode. And speaking of Substack, I plan on releasing a Hornets free agency off-season piece on Monday, June 17th. To get that newsletter right away, go over to buzzbeat.substack.com, enter your email into that database, and it's going to be a 10-minute read, over 2,000 words. And the best news, that one is going to be a free piece. So for Dylan, I am Richie.